were similar, especially in the training and preparation for advisors. I want to talk about the Vietnamese Marine Corps because it was unique and different, and about the advisory preparation, what we went through, describe the MATA course that was mentioned, and a little bit about the advisor's role at that time and what life was like for us day to day. Back in the time of the French Indochina War, the United States Marine Corps sent a lieutenant colonel named Victor Croziat to be an observer. He spoke fluent French and fluent Vietnamese. He spent a long period of time, almost the duration of the war there. And Croziat, at the end of the war, was asked to stay on by the South Vietnamese government and help create a riverine force. After that, he was asked to stay on to create a Vietnamese Marine Corps. Now, their Marine Corps was not like the Marine Corps we have. Fundamentally, it was light infantry. At the time I was an advisor in 1967, it consisted of 5 battalions in the field and 1 coming online. Eventually, by the end of the war, the Vietnamese Marines achieved about division-level strength. The Vietnamese Marines, along with the Vietnamese Airborne, were considered the national strike force, the most elite of their forces. And what that meant is you would be assigned to a corps or a special area dependent upon the situation, the enemy situation. So as an advisor to Vietnamese Marines, I saw all 4 corps areas, as my counterparts did as well. And I saw the Capital Military District and what was called the Rung Sat Special Zone, the Forest of Death, which was the mangrove swamps leading up to Saigon from the port at Vung Tau. And of course, the advantages of that in many ways is you saw the war from the kind of almost conventional fighting in the North in I Corps to the guerrilla fighting, to the riverine forces that we participated in, to the jungle operations along the Cambodian border. So it was day to day, month to month, week to week. You could be sent anywhere depending upon the need. Basically, the Airborne and the Marines were the National Reserves, or National Strike Force, I said. The Corps Strike Forces were the Rangers. Croziat felt that the most successful units he observed in terms of French advisors were those where the French totally committed themselves and trusted themselves to be part of the Vietnamese unit. And he recommended that we, the Marine Advisory Unit, adopt the same ideology, the same kind of philosophy in advising. We only had 2 advisors to a battalion. The senior advisor stayed with the battalion commander all the time, and the junior advisor, which I was, you stayed usually with the lead company, or if the battalion was split or operating, you stayed with the lead patrol or the unit with the XO if the battalion was split for distributed operations. We were sent to, in the time I was an advisor in 1967, to Army Special Warfare School to go through the MATA course. At that time, as was mentioned, it was a 6-week course. The MATA course put us through training in counterinsurgency, which I thought was extremely effective. The Special Forces instructors down there were exceptionally knowledgeable. We were actually given a tremendous library of the books and the writings and the thought at that time for us to keep. We were immersed in language training. The first 4 hours of every day, which was a long day, was language training. But we were taught the language by Vietnamese. There were Vietnamese families that lived in around Fort Bragg that taught language and then invited us into their homes so that we could further get customs training and cultural training. And I thought that was extremely valuable in preparing us. We had exceptional training at the tactical level, particularly in counter-guerrilla operations, counterinsurgency operations, and then we had specialized training in weapons and demolitions and communications. And the weapons training was to give us experience in all the weapons that were present in Vietnam. At that time, the Vietnamese did not have M16s, for example. They had the old Marshall series of arms. We had M1s, Thompson submachine guns, grease guns, old .30 caliber machine guns. And we learned a lot about the weapons that they possessed, which were old U.S. family weapons, and about enemy weapons. And we had to qualify on all those. extensive training in demolitions. You know, usually the Special Forces with assistance from the 82nd Airborne put us through some very realistic demolition training. And of course, we had to learn to use all the radios that existed there, both friendly and enemy, and how to operate them and make them operational. The 6 weeks was intense. I thought it was a great preparation. We learned enough of the language, I think, to get by. Although in my experience with the Vietnamese Marines, virtually all the officers spoke English. And they wanted to use English because that was their ticket to get to school back in the States. But obviously, in the villages and with the enlisted Marines and your day-to-day life, you really had to develop far beyond what we were given, our language capabilities to get by. We wore their uniforms. We ate their food. When I say we ate their food, the Vietnamese did not have C rations or MREs. They bought their food if we were operating near a populated area, and if we were not, we hunted and foraged for our food. So it was a great experience to spend 2 hours a day shooting a monkey or killing a snake or picking breadfruit or bamboo shoots for your dinner, especially when you were on patrol in some of the more isolated areas out there. As I said, we wore their uniforms, we carried their weapons. The Vietnamese government had a quartering act, so when we were near villages, we literally moved into the houses of the people. So you lived with the people, with the exception of the times you were out in areas, obviously, that weren't populated, the mountainous areas or in the jungles, and you got to know the people and see the war from the eyes of the people. The advisor's role was primarily to provide fire support, American assets, air, naval gunfire, artillery, also to coordinate operations with U.S. units if we were operating side by side, and to ensure the logistics and transportation requirements were met. If we were to be lifted, which we often were for different parts of the country, we had to do it usually through U.S. assets, and we had to coordinate the lift. And the Vietnamese forces had the lowest priority, so moving a unit took quite a bit of time to get them there. We had no enlisted members of our advisory organization, as I said, just 2 officers. So you had a radio operator and you had what we called a cowboy. The cowboy was kind of your Batman. He took care of you. He made sure you were fed. He made sure you didn't get shot. You know, he tried to give you the best advice he could in terms of operating day-to-day with the Vietnamese. In my role as a junior advisor, I spent most of my time with the company commanders and the platoon commanders, usually at company-size operations or lower. As I said, the Vietnamese Marines were basically light infantry, about 80-man companies, about a 500-man battalion. They had some light machine guns, they had BARs, they had M1s and Thompsons and grease guns, as I said before. They had small caliber recoilless rifles, which they rarely took to the field. They had artillery units, but they were very small, you know, less than a battalion's worth of artillery, old 105s that some of them were smoothbore, so we didn't call in very much close fire with those, but really relied on U.S. units. Day to day, we didn't provide really tactical advice. I found that the Vietnamese Marines were highly skilled tactically. I learned more from them than I could ever impart. I was assigned as a second lieutenant to the advisory unit. I met none of those qualifications that were previously mentioned because basically we were sending people over there to fill as many billets as we could, given the operations that had consumed most of the operational forces of the Marine Corps in the North, with the 2 divisions plus that by then had gone into I Corps in the North. The main function for us was the fire support and the coordination, with U.S. units when we operated side by side. The Vietnamese Marine Corps was modeled on the U.S. Marine Corps in many respects. They had a boot camp very similar to ours. Their NCOs came to the States for instruction. Their officers came through our basic course for lieutenants, our career course, which was then called Amphibious Warfare School for the captains, and our Marine Corps Command and Staff College. I think one of the strengths of the advisory unit, beside the fact that we didn't have advisory teams and we sort of immersed ourselves into their organization and culture, is that we connected to the Vietnamese Marines very closely. They knew they would see us again. Those Vietnamese Marines as they became NCOs and officers, would come back to Quantico, Parris Island, San Diego, and they would be training. I saw many of the Vietnamese Marines I knew as lieutenants, later on as colonels, before obviously they collapsed. And so this sort of bond, this sort of organizational unit to unit, meant that they felt that they had to live up to the reputation. They took great pride in being called Marines. Virtually every Marine in boot camp had the equivalent of USMC, Tui Quan Luk Chien, TQLC, tattooed on his right arm. On his left arm, he had tattooed Sat Kang, kill communists. And that was done for several reasons. Not only motivational, but he knew he couldn't be captured, you know, and because they knew who he was. We were extremely proud of our Vietnamese units. They marched at the head of the National Day Parade every year in Vietnam, and they became clearly the political force in that country. That became a little bit dicey for us because they were the kingmakers. They were the ones that overthrew President Diem and Nhu. They were the ones that actually executed him. They took the palace in the coup of '65. They put down the revolt of the Buddhists in I Corps, which basically was an Arvin division up there in '65 also. So it was a little tricky because they were this political force, and during elections would come and ring Saigon to ensure whoever they were supporting would become president. At that time, our instructions were to leave the units, but we couldn't leave the units. There was nowhere to go, so we just tried to keep a low profile. The advisory effort, when you were totally immersed in the culture, took a toll on you. By the time my advisory tour was coming near to its end, I think I had about a month left, I had contracted malaria, mononucleosis, dysentery, and hepatitis. And I was down to 123 pounds and was trying to hang on for my last month, but eventually I had to go see. We were operating, was the beginning of the Tet Offensive, the first battle in the Bang San Plain, and we had been committed as the Corps Reserve. And I came across a U.S. Army unit that I, 1st Air Cav, went in to see the doctor there on the hill they were operating from, and he looked at me and he said, "You're gone. You're gone or you're dead." You know, I had become so jaundiced, my urine looked like black coffee, and I was evacuated. It took many months to recover. But I tell you that story because that was not uncommon. You know, we did have our advisors that were wounded and killed, but most of the advisors suffered health issues, and very few advisors finished a whole tour without a significant health problem or eventually being evacuated because of the health problem. I really, in reflection, look back at the advisory effort, especially recently because my son, who was a Marine officer, was an advisor in Afghanistan to an Afghan commando company. And we compared notes. And I had actually talked to General Mattis and several others about the advisory effort. The one thing I thought was most important about creating effectiveness was this sort of tie unit to unit. The Vietnamese Airborne, the Vietnamese Rangers had this same kind of association. But when they had a title like Marine, and they knew what it meant, and they knew they would see that advisor again, not just for his one-year tour, but they would be back at our schools, they would continue to see us, they would continue to be held accountable, they understood the standards that went with that. That made that sort of bond a lot stronger. And I think we lost that lesson. I saw that with the Marines, and when we operated with the Vietnamese Airborne, I saw that same relationship, and to a degree with the Ranger units. Some of the ARVN units, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, were very effective too. The first ARVN unit in I Corps became very good. The Marines up there adopted them, and through the course of the war, they improved greatly. I went back for a second tour in Vietnam as a company commander in the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines in I Corps, and you could see the improvement of those units. So where there was an American organization that adopted them and really invested in them, they became very strong. The same was true, I thought, when we operated in the Delta with the Vietnamese riverine units. We were a riverine unit too. We operated out of small fiberglass boats and set in ambushes along the shipping channels down in the mangrove swamps, and we operated with the 9th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, which was then the Mobile Riverine Force, and they had a Vietnamese counterpart, Army counterpart, that was well-trained, and especially well-trained in the techniques involved in the Riverine Force. The advisory experience, to sort of give you a little bit of reflection, taught me something. And I think what first hit me, when I left the Vietnamese Marines and came back to the States, I was assigned to our basic school as an instructor to teach counterinsurgency, counter-guerrilla operations, scouting and patrolling, and many of the tactical skills we had experienced there, and actually riverine operations and several other unique things that are part of the war that we had experienced. At that time, I was meeting up with my classmates. My classmates had gone on to the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions in the North. So we had each completed our tours and were coming back, and of course in that position where we were creating the instruction and obviously teaching about the war, we had actually built Vietnamese villages and the woods in Quantico and a number of other things. We started talking about the war and comparing notes. And what struck me most was what a different war I saw. Those that saw that war from inside a U.S. unit, despite the fact that certainly they saw plenty of combat as we did, they saw a different war than I did. I saw the war through the eyes of the Vietnamese people. I saw the war through the eyes of villagers that I lived with. I saw the war through the eyes of Vietnamese soldiers and Marines that weren't there on one-year tours, but were there for the duration. I saw the war from the Delta to the DMZ. I saw the war from Cambodia to the coastal plains in the east. And it was a totally different perspective than I was hearing from my counterparts. When you see it from their perspective, you see different objectives. I watched U.S. units. The Vietnamese used to complain that you guys got it wrong. The emphasis was on attrition and body count in the U.S. units. The way to look good was to stack up bodies. And the Vietnamese Marines used to say, we don't count bodies. That is not how this war is going to be won. They understood the concept of hot hearts and minds and what needed to be done. In the course of my time there, we took a lot of prisoners, and I talked to a number of those prisoners, some North Vietnamese soldiers, some Viet Cong. And you had a whole different perspective, especially since I could relate to them more through my Vietnamese counterparts. Actually, in some cases, some of the prisoners we took actually had gone to school with some of the Vietnamese Marine officers. Our battalion doctor, we captured a regimental medical post, and the head doctor there, the Viet Cong doctor, had gone to France in medical school with our battalion doctor. And they spent a lot of time trying to understand the mentality from the other side, and obviously had empathy and could relate to it. So walking away from the advisory tour, I think most of all, gave me a sense of what this war was all about. And I really felt as I came away from that we didn't understand one thing that was fundamental to the Vietnamese people. If you want them to die for something, you've got to give them something. And as I had these discussions with people that looked back at Saigon and saw a government that was corrupt and rotating generals back there, you know, there was a coup a month back there, almost, in those rotating generals. I remember one village chief's wife telling me, what do you want me to die for? You know, give me something to fight for and to die for, and my sons to die for. And that was a lesson we didn't get. I think we still believed you were going to shoot your way to victory. And that war was not the kind of war that result would have led to the kind of victory we wanted. The other thing that became clear to me is you can't have a sanctuary that is untouched virtually and fight a war like that. And we had one in North Vietnam. Sure, we bombed them once in a while, but basically Cambodia, Laos, North Vietnam were sanctuaries. They had open lines. They had a base of operations that we didn't really touch. And we constantly had to go back to the same places to fight against those kinds of lines of communication that we didn't really intercede and interdict in any, I think, very effective way. And if we didn't capture the hearts of the people, if we couldn't give them something to fight for, if we weren't willing to ensure that the government was responsive to the needs of the people, and we weren't willing to cut off a base of supplies that was endless, we eventually could not win that conflict, despite all the victories on the battlefield. And the most disappointing thing was to see what happened to my Vietnamese Marines. In 1973, in the Eastern Offensive, when basically the United States had pulled out, the North came south in force, and the South Vietnamese military beat them back in the Eastern Offensive of 1973. Then all aid was cut. They were down to few rounds of ammunition, didn't have the maintenance and support, so when the North came back in 1975, we had left them high and dry, and they couldn't withstand the onslaught that came back. I think that Vietnam was rich in lessons that we never learned. After I left Vietnam, my second tour, I ran a training center in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And I remember a general coming down there to look at our training, which had now become more conventional. Obviously, we were all focused back onto the Fulda Gap and the Central Front, in case of the Marines, what we did on the flanks from Norway to the Mediterranean. And the general very proudly said to a more senior general, "The war's over. We got our head out of the jungle. We're out of the jungle, and we're just going to forget that experience." And what struck me as a young captain at that time is we're going to forget an experience and not learn the lessons that we're going to be doomed to repeat again because we haven't studied those lessons. The enemy beat us strategically, didn't beat us tactically. They didn't beat us in terms of what we were able to develop in military capability with the South Vietnamese, but they beat us psychologically and they beat us strategically. And that lesson was never carried over. And I think that might have been the greatest reflection that hit me, especially from that experience of seeing the war from the people. Thank you.
Well, I think I was asked to come here to give the perspective of an advisor in Vietnam at the latter part of the war, as the war was winding down, at least the American part. So I propose to talk a little bit about my personal experience, and then some observations about being an advisor, and then some comments that Dr. Huffman asked me to talk about on ARVN combat performance in light of the U.S. advisory effort over the years. I guess the place to start is the beginning with my early background. I graduated and received my commission in the infantry from Texas A&M University. Went to Fort Benning, Georgia, thanks for the shout out, for the customary schooling before being assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division in Germany. By that particular point, 1970, the ills of Vietnam were being visited on the rest of the Army, and they were being visited on U.S. Army Europe in spades. So I spent